Thank you all very much. In my hometown, in New York, there is under negotiation at the United Nations a new treaty on the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in areas of the ocean beyond the jurisdiction of any country. The acronym you need to know is BBNJ. Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. You'll hear that acronym a few times in what follows. To give you a sense, there were sort of preparatory and informal discussions about this treaty for almost a decade. And then, a little more than a year ago, the United Nations launched formal negotiations on this treaty in a so-called intergovernmental conference, 2 sessions of which have already taken place, most recently in March. Next one will be in August, and another one sometime in the first half of next year. The goal is to create a legally binding instrument that has a lot of different elements to it. We'll be talking about one of those elements now. It's the topic that has brought us all here together: area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. Yes, CAMLR and a number of other treaty regimes around the world have some capacity to create these types of protected areas on the high seas. But it's a patchwork quilt, if you will, and there is no comprehensive system to do this on a global basis. One of the things this treaty might produce is such a system. And here to talk a little bit about different aspects of these negotiations and where they might wind up, I'm pleased to introduce panel 2. Once again, you have long bios available to you. I'll just introduce them very briefly. My friend Simi Payne is an associate professor at Rutgers University. Florian Bato works in the permanent mission of Monaco to the United Nations, involved in the negotiation of this treaty. Liz Karen, my friend and colleague from Pew, works on this issue for her organization. Welcome to you all. Simi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Shall I?
Whatever you like.
Okay. Well, much sweat. Thank you, Ambassador Bolton, for the introduction and the invitation to speak today. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests, and those watching remotely, a High Seas Biodiversity Treaty could be an instrument to create new high seas marine protected areas, to provide refugia, and boost the resilience of marine life to pollution, resource extraction, and climate change. This is the kind of thing that we would be protecting. A new treaty could coordinate existing treaties that govern a wide range of activities. And as you've heard, some of the people here have been working on this since the last century. They probably feel like they're going to be working on it into the next century. For those who haven't been imbued with law of the sea and marine protected areas the way they have, my role is to provide a little bit of framing. And because I'm a lawyer, I'm going to provide the legal framing, mindful of both Dr. Earle's plea for action now and Ambassador Cooper's point that it is the legal instruments that take so long to negotiate and put in place, but that provide us with frameworks and rules to work with that will keep going after the initial passion has been passed on and people are implementing these things. So this is going to be part of the long history of the law of the sea. This is an image from the negotiations of the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea that began in 1973, negotiations that concluded in establishing the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea that creates the rights and responsibilities of nations for the world ocean. Now, different from CAMLR and the Antarctic Treaty, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea applies to all the world ocean. And the agreement that we're in the process of negotiating will also apply to all of the world ocean. That's about half of the surface of the planet, because this agreement is for areas beyond national jurisdiction. Okay, so in 1994, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea entered into force, and today 167 states out of 195 that exist, plus the European Union, are parties. The United States is not, despite long-standing support from the executive branch of the U.S. government. Maybe one day we will become a party, but the U.S. currently recognizes the convention by and large as legally binding as customary international law. There are some bumps and exclusions there, but we don't have time today to discuss those. The convention extended national control over ocean resources to 200 miles from coastal baseline by allowing nations to declare an exclusive economic zone. And this map shows those lines 200 miles out from the continents and from islands. So you can get a sense that the space in between those lines is what we call the high seas as a legal term, and we call it areas beyond national jurisdiction, abbreviated as ABNJ. So if you want to get into dealing with this treaty, you have to remember ABNJ. And by extension, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction is the BBNJ acronym that Dave Bolton just mentioned. So UNCLOS provides a framework for all the world's oceans, as I said, and it establishes fundamental principles. Amongst those is the obligation to cooperate to protect the marine environment and conserve high seas life, from microorganisms to the blue whale. It also refers to the obligation to use best available science. The BBNJ agreement will be the third implementing agreement to the convention, and so it will give content to these principles, which are very bare bones as it is. However, UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, exists in a world of many other treaties, and these are just a few indicative ones. For example, there are sectoral treaties that deal with certain activities. For instance, regional fishery management organizations to manage fisheries on a regional basis, or the 1994 implementing agreement for deep seabed mining. Other kinds of ocean activities are addressed through, for instance, ship construction or ship operations are addressed through treaties established through the International Maritime Organization. And there's many others, okay? So there's hundreds of these agreements. Between them, there are gaps, there are conflicting interests, and there's often weak implementation. Overall, when it comes to living resources in the world's ocean, there's been a failure to consistently base governance decisions on the best available science. Today, this is a map of marine traffic, and it just, obviously not to scale. Each of those dots is a ship. They're not that big, but that's a lot of ships nonetheless. And if you go to this map, you can do all kinds of fun interactions to track ships and get a sense of what's really going on in the ocean. This kind of density and increase in marine shipping poses the kind of threat that you've already heard about with regard to Antarctica, but across all the world's oceans. Again, fishing has become a pervasive activity that threatens certain species and associated ecosystems. Soon, deep seabed mining is anticipated to start, and of course, warming, acidification, and deoxygenation from the effects of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is having a negative impact on the living creatures in the world ocean. Well, just as the ocean has changed over time, so have the UN negotiations. This looks very different in terms of gender and technology than the slide I showed you earlier. And this is a picture from this spring, the informal working group on area-based management tools, including marine protected areas, at the Intergovernmental Conference meeting. This is facilitated by Alice Revell of New Zealand. To get to this point, years of study leading to advocacy for an agreement for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity led us down the long, winding road. And it resulted in a carefully negotiated package. Now, you may be surprised, as I was when I first saw it, that a treaty negotiation with such a vast title, it's actually that long title in italics, an international legally binding instrument under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction, has 4 elements. One is marine genetic resources, and this addresses the potential value of marine creatures, for instance, those that have antifreeze in their bodies. Of course, some of their value may be for pharmaceuticals that would be life-saving, but the antifreeze is, it turns out, useful for keeping your ice cream from crystallizing when it melts and refreezes. But commercial products like that may have value, and who should benefit from that value is one of the questions. A second element, and this is an environmental governance tool, is the one that we're here to discuss today, area-based management tools, which is a broad category within which marine protected areas are one element. The other 2 are environmental impact assessments. You can't regulate what you don't know, so that is a very valuable information gathering tool. And capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, which is both a development tool and an implementation tool. So that are the elements that we're negotiating. And there are things that are striking that aren't included. Plastic waste is a land-based pollution that's not included in this negotiation. We may need some other instrument for that, but it's not being dealt with here. We're also still working on the question of how all of those other hundreds of pre-existing agreements will be integrated with this new agreement. But the measures that are included could provide protection for the 97% of the ocean that is currently unprotected, including the unique Sargasso Sea off the southern Atlantic coast of the US, where this seahorse lives. We have this problem of how to think globally about the problems that we're facing and to integrate the legal issues with the real scientific needs. UNCLOS states that the problems of ocean space should be considered as a whole, and yet states through the UN General Assembly have mandated that the BBNJ agreement should not undermine existing relevant legal instruments and frameworks and relevant global, regional, and sectoral bodies. Over the next year, a path will have to be found to balance the interests of coastal states, fishing states, industrial sectors, and the international community reflected in all these regimes, to prioritize the role of science in decision-making, and to provide tools for effective compliance, including dispute settlement. My colleagues will tell you more about how they envision this to be done. Thank you.
Well done, Simi. Thank you so much for that. Florian.
Thank you very, very much, Ambassador Bolton. I wish also, of course, to thank the Wilson Center and the Pew Charitable Trust for convening this extremely timely discussion. And it's a great honor to present to you the perspective of the government of Monaco in that negotiation. Which button is it? This one? Perfect. Sorry for that. The premises of our position, the other side of this coin also is our vision of why we need a BBNJ agreement, why we need an agreement to conserve and sustainably use the marine biodiversity in the areas beyond national jurisdiction. Our first starting point is that we need a legal framework to do so, because existing organizations very often do not have this as their primary mandate. There is a fragmentation, and in our view, we need a regime to effectively protect marine biodiversity. The second point is that MPAs are cross-sectoral, and they can have better results than other tools. While we recognize there is a variety of tools, MPAs might not be established by other organizations, and we need to fill this gap. In that regard, a specific objective of MPAs in particular can be the long-term conservation of marine biodiversity for future generation. Conservation, sustainable use must go together. It cannot be anything else than this. And we believe that MPAs are a true tool to ensure that this happens. We can also look at other specific objectives, like the resilience of some habitats and ecosystems, as well as the improvement of oceans productivity as a whole. And our third starting point is that the BBNJ agreement is a way to enhance implementation of some of UNCLOS provisions, like the obligation to preserve the marine environment, and it is a way to enhance better cooperation and coordination. A few key points of the negotiation that will benefit from further discussion in the coming sessions of the conference. In my views, we need to move away from labels around how we are going to establish those tools. We are often talking among ourselves in the negotiation of a global model versus a regional model. I think this will needs to change. Because we won't have a purely global or a purely regional way of establishing new MPAs. The challenge of IGC3 will be to find the right tuning to this process to accommodate all delegations. On the first hand, in our views, we see shortcomings with the status quo because there are gaps and because it would leave implementation solely to other organizations that, once again, might not have the protection of marine biodiversity as the core of their activities. On the other hand, all delegations, including, of course, Monaco, recognize that the BBNJ agreement should not undermine any other existing instruments or other existing bodies. So the question of not undermining is key in that process, and there is a couple of ways to formulate it or to look at it. It can be seen as a provision saying that we cannot take some decisions and we cannot put some measures in place. But the other more affirmative way of putting this is that we can use this to create coherence with what already exists. But no matter how we consider this formulation, we as Monaco do not support a system that ignores the experience and the expertise that exists. We do not support a system that would impose decision on any other organizations. But on the contrary, where there are gaps and where BBNJ, at the BBNJ agreement, can bring something to the table, and we do believe that establishing MPAs is a true added value of the BBNJ instrument. We support decisions to be taken at the global level by the BBNJ body, the decision-making body that would be created by the BBNJ agreement. On the next slide, it's a very concise overview of our position. We support an overarching framework, as I said. We support a COP to be able to directly establish new MPAs without needing a decision by other bodies. We strongly support the input of science and decisions based on the best available science. It is particularly important to reinforce the science policy interface, we need to make sure that scientists are using a language that is useful for policymakers so that they can take the necessary decisions, and we need to make sure that scientific findings find their way to the policymakers. Lastly, we support the establishment of a network of MPAs that are well connected and well managed, and we believe that the implementation of a future BBNJ agreement can have a critical role to play in that regard and to reach our internationally agreed goals. And on my last slide, I wanted to expose a possible process for the establishment of new MPAs, noting that there is a range of proposals on the table. That's only one of those. And noting that positions, of course, are evolving quite rapidly and that we are entering a negotiation phase. So we won't have exactly this, but this is our proposal to the conference. The first step of that process would be the proposal of a new MPA that would be done by states parties, whether individually or collectively. States parties in that regard can receive input from a wide range of stakeholders advocating for proposing a new MPA. It could be, of course, civil society, NGOs, the academic sector, etc. The initial proposals to establish a new MPA should be made publicly available and circulated to all interested stakeholders by the secretariats of a future BBNJ instrument. Several elements might be contained in the proposal, and they should be, it's not an exhaustive list. It should be the geographical boundaries of the area. It should be a description of the state of the marine biodiversity in the area. It should be a description of human activities in the area and their possible impact or cumulative impact, the conservation objectives, information on existing organizations that would be relevant, and initial elements of a draft management plan. So all this will be taken up by the establishment process, and it would be extensively the object of consultation. Consultation is a key step of the process. It must be inclusive, transparent, and open to all relevant stakeholders. And those stakeholders are, of course, states parties, but also states non-parties, existing relevant international, regional, and sectoral organizations, civil society, scientific and academic sectors, as well as NGOs. All would be invited to provide feedback on the initial proposal and the subsequent development of the proposal. In our view, the consultation of all stakeholders is absolutely key to make sure that the expertise of existing bodies is fully taken on board and that we do not undermine them. Scientific input shall also be provided by an advisory scientific body that would be created by the instrument with a specific mandate of providing some feedback, comments, recommendations on proposals to be sure that we take into account the best available science. Then, during the consultation process, there would be a back and forth between the initial proponent, all the stakeholders, so that the proponent can take into account what has been said and can make the proposal evolve so that everyone has comfort about the proposal that is on the table until the proponent decides to bring it to the decision-making body, which in our view should be a conference of parties of the new instrument. When a decision would be taken by the conference of parties, we believe it should be, of course, notified to all stakeholders, and once again, that includes non-parties and existing bodies. The designation of an MPA should not be made for a definite period of time, but should be made in such a way that even if we have a review process and a monitoring process, it is here long enough to produce long-term effects on the marine biodiversity. The question of implementation, states parties would have a primary binding obligation to implement the decisions, and the states parties to the BBNJ agreement could work in the framework of other existing bodies so that complementary measures could be taken once again to uphold the decisions and to work in favor of the most holistic possible implementation of the proposal for the protection of marine biodiversity. And the very last step that I'm going to touch upon is the monitoring and review. States parties shall report on implementation. And just to note here the need for an adaptive management, meaning that the decisions could be updated by a conference of parties on the basis of the best scientific information in order to better reach conservation objectives. And with this, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florian. Finally, Liz Karen, last but not least.
Thank you, Ambassador Bolton, and thank you to the Prince Albert II Foundation as well for providing the resources for us to convene today and share with you some of the importance of why it is to protect the high seas. And thank you all for sticking with us this afternoon. So I'm very grateful to Dr. Earle and also to my colleagues on the Southern Oceans work for providing all of the wonderful and stunning visual images of the biodiversity, the richness of biodiversity and life in the ocean that we are trying to protect. It's very illustrative and indicative of what we are working for in the High Seas Treaty. Unfortunately, we tend to do it in a windowless room, not quite in the basement of the UN anymore. We've got an elevated floor, but there's still no windows. Staring at text with no pretty pictures and lots of brackets. But with that, and but wanted to sort of provide some perspective too about what is the importance of protecting the high seas. And the high seas are home to what scientists believe are among the greatest reservoirs of biodiversity left on Earth. It's estimated that they contain at least 200,000 unidentified species and potentially millions. The deep sea represents 95% of the living space by volume on the planet. The high seas also support some of the world's largest fisheries and provide essential habitat, including for those highly valued fish species that Sylvia touched about this earlier that migrate across the open ocean. Over 40% of commercially important species are caught in both coastal waters and the high seas, and marine fisheries directly or indirectly employ over 200 million people. And high seas fisheries account for up to $16 billion US. To provide a specific example, eel fishing in North America and Europe is valued at $66 million per year US, and their spawning grounds are primarily in the Sargasso Sea, which is largely in the high seas area. And of course, the high seas provide critical ecological functions such as oxygen production and carbon capture and storage, which are essential, again, as Dr. Earle mentioned, in support of human life. The oceans absorb about 40% of carbon dioxide emissions, with an estimated economic value of carbon storage ranging from 74 billion to 222 billion per year. But there are threats to the high seas, as we've touched upon. Overfishing continues to be one of the most visible threats and active threats to the high seas. The most recent State of the Oceans report that was released last year showed that the trend of overfishing of high sea stocks in particular continues to increase. So we are, despite regional fisheries management organizations' efforts to sustainably manage their resources, those bodies are not necessarily doing a very good job. International shipping, the international shipping industry, it carries about 90% of the world trade. Shipping pollution or pollution related to shipping could range from noise pollution, bilge of wastewater, transport of invasive species across the open ocean, and the like. Deep sea mining, which is in an exploratory phase right now, has the potential, seems to be on track towards a commercial exploitation direction, and the full extent of the damage that these mining operations will cause is still uncertain. But what we do know is that the deep sea is a very sensitive environment and would take a long time to recover from any adverse impacts. We see that from the bottom trawling industries and the impacts of that. And then there's climate change. which is a result of human activity, though maybe a little less, or directly and indirectly, which poses a threat through ocean acidification to ocean biodiversity. And there are threats that we yet don't even know, industries that are emerging, some of which are being talked about: open ocean aquaculture, geoengineering. I recently saw a headline for the development of floating land masses for places to put the billions of people that we are of our global population. And these are industries that have no body, global or sectoral, to manage them. So this is where the BBNJ treaty, the High Seas Treaty, comes in as an opportunity to put conservation at the focus of the discussion of how we manage the high seas in our ocean environment. The UNCLOS founders or drafters were very forward-thinking in incorporating an article and language in there for the protection and conservation of the marine environment, but it has taken us decades to carry forward that mandate and operationalize it, and that is what we are trying to accomplish here with this new agreement. So within area-based management tools, there's a basket of tools there, regional tools such as the International Maritime Organization has a tool for designating particularly sensitive sea areas. However, none of those are currently designated in the high seas. Some regional fisheries management organizations have a tool to designate vulnerable marine areas. Some of those are in the high seas. Not all of those are necessarily where scientists would say they need to be placed, because being fisheries management organizations, they balance the needs of the fishing versus the conservation. And then within the International Seabed Authority, there's a process for designating areas of particular environmental importance around where mining exploration can occur, though the process for designating that, I think, is along the lines of where the buffer zones might be for the projected sediment plumes, rather than what is the biological value of those areas. In addition, I think what this High Seas Treaty is hoping to do is envision future tools for those emerging industries or activities that I mentioned, as well as allow for the creation of marine protected areas, which I think by the icons is sort of the more multi-purpose tool for marine conservation in the high seas. So just briefly a definition, there are many, but of what we are talking about when we are talking about marine conservation. I think the important keywords that we are to focus on is, obviously geographically defined marine area, but where human activities are regulated, managed, or prohibited in order to afford comprehensive protection. And I think the word comprehensive is really key here. As I mentioned before, there are these sectoral tools that can afford some protection against those sectoral activities, but there's nothing currently that allows for that cross-sectoral conservation or management of conservation. I can say here as well. And the benefits of MPAs are many. Some of you may be aware of the recent UN biodiversity report that mentioned that there are as much as 1 million species that are threatened as a result of human activities, and many of those are in the marine environment. And that report also pointed to marine protected areas as one of the best tools that we have within the marine environment for protecting biodiversity. And that is for protecting habitat, species, and those critical areas for marine life, safeguarding biodiversity, protecting those top predators that maintain the balance of the ecosystem, and building resilience to climate change. And then, as Ambassador Bolton mentioned before, what we're facing now is a patchwork of governance in the ocean sphere. So this is an illustration of just some of the global or sectoral bodies that have some management authority in the high seas. Most of them are regional fisheries management organizations or regional seas organizations. Not listed here are ones with a global mandate, such as the International Maritime Organization or the International Seabed Authority, but you could imagine those overlaid on top of it. It's roughly over 20 organizations. That being said, none of them have a conservation as the core, their core mandate. There are exceptions, of course. We heard about the Southern Oceans before, obviously a place where they've been able to carry forward marine protected areas, including areas that are with strict fishing prohibitions. And because of the Antarctic Treaty and the provisions and prohibitions on other industrial activities in the Southern Oceans and Antarctica, the management of the fisheries is sufficient to create these full protected areas. In the Northeast Atlantic, there's OSPAR, Regional Seas Organization, that is can identify, designate marine protected areas, but is reliant upon negotiating with other sectoral bodies, fishing bodies, the International Maritime Organization, the International Seabed Authority, the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission, if I got that right, to trying to de-acronym things a little bit, to enable those management measures to really fulfill the ambition and the mandate of those marine protected areas, as well as in the Mediterranean has its own uniqueness as well. But as I mentioned, those areas have unique enabling conditions, and for the rest of the oceans, those don't exist. So for the High Seas Treaty, we envision some key elements, building on what Florian said, a global decision-making body that it can provide a forum for cooperation and coordination with other bodies, but also has the mandate and authority to ensure meaningful conservation measures are undertaken in the high seas. And as part of that, a clear mechanism, legal mechanism for establishing high seas marine protected areas, which have clear conservation objectives, proposals with conservation management measures, an inclusive consultation process, a mechanism for scientific review, clear decision making. I appreciate the consensus. I appreciate what consensus brings to the table, and particularly for the Southern Oceans, noting that it is a much smaller grouping of countries than we're envisioning here. So Simi had mentioned earlier that it's 165 plus that are members of the Law of the Sea Convention. There are actually over 190 parties that are part of the negotiations in New York on this treaty, because it is open to non-parties of UNCLOS, as well as a few others that I'm sort of escapes my mind. But the upshot being is that since the high seas is really the last global commons, we would like this to be a virtually or nearly universally adopted agreement, to try to engage in consensus with so many parties through a process that we hope will be rigorous and science-based. Seems very challenging. We will strive for consensus, as we have throughout the negotiations, or as parties have throughout the negotiations. But I think, CAMLR celebrated its 60th anniversary. There have been updates in international law, updated mechanisms like voting that have come forward or more commonly used, that are good sort of mechanisms to help, if not help drive in that strive to consensus. And lastly, but not leastly, obviously, there's the implementation and monitoring and review processes, which are very important. We would see those carried out mainly by states and through their own ability to control the activities of their national entities, but also through their engagement through these other regional and sectoral bodies that they are a member of. And then just, I think one of the panelists earlier, my colleagues here mentioned the long road to high seas protections, or the pathway. So these negotiations have been going on for a long time. This package has been unpacked and unpacked again, and yet unpacked again many times over a decade. The point here is just to say we are. It seems like the negotiations just started. And in a way, the formal negotiations did just start. But it didn't come out of thin air. It builds upon a very rich elaboration of the issues and discussion that's taken place for a long time. And so we are hoping that in this stage, we can move forward towards an ambitious new treaty that embodies the conservation objectives that I think that all the members that are engaged in it are hoping to achieve through the next really 2 meetings that are scheduled. The UN General Assembly had mandated 4 meetings for this intergovernmental conference, which is the formal negotiation process. We are coming up on our 3rd meeting in August. We just, a couple of days ago, got our hands on the advanced, unedited English version of the draft treaty text, and woohoo! I'd much rather be diving with sharks, but which I've done. This is what we get excited about in the UN system. But joking aside, that it is very exciting because I think it shows that this is real and it is achievable. It is ambitious, but I think that the states have brought us to this point, and it's just a question now of really buckling down and getting over the finish line. So with that, I will conclude.
Thanks very much, Liz. Thanks to all 3 panelists. We do have a few minutes for questions, and we once again have a roving microphone or 2. Yes, ma'am, right in the middle. Please tell us who you are.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Elsa Yosef, and first of all, I just want to say thank you all and the previous panel for all of your hard work in protecting life in the oceans. I hesitate to say this, but if I may follow the question from Dr. Earle and figuring out what are your takes on maybe some of the barriers that are preventing preventing folks in the room in these negotiations from either feeling the urgency of impacts from climate change on the marine ecosystem to, further drive action, and whatever those hurdles might be, what solutions do you think exist to maybe surmount some of those? Or is the deliberative nature of international negotiation just inherently a long, exhausting process, and we're sort of resigning ourselves to not being responsive to the urgency that is demanded from climate change?
Thank you. Do we have any takers from that one? What are the main obstacles? Why has this process taken as long as it has? What can help spur it forward? My thoughts? Yeah, Simi?
Have you ever tried to plan a family vacation? It's immensely complex, and there's many conflicting interests. And I think, as I've been listening to recent discussions and workshops and things, I've also become very aware of it's not just the people in the room there who are, engaged in the task of getting a biodiversity treaty. But when they go home, their governments have people who are equally committed to developing a productive fishery or to staking a claim on deep seabed minerals, or there's a lot of other conflicts to be resolved. So I think part of it is the complexity of it and the competing interests. There are many other reasons, though, and perhaps others would care to comment on those.
Thank you. Florian?
Thank you very much. It's indeed a very, very good question. I'm not sure I can speak for other delegations of what are their barriers, but the way for us who want this treaty to answer these kind of concerns is to show that we don't want to limit the activities in the high seas, but we want to make sure that together we reach a point where we can improve the ocean health and we can improve the protection of marine biodiversity. We need to show that we are coming only with the best interests of the planet, and we're not trying to limit anyone, to impose things on anyone. And I think we must, but that's the hard part, go sometimes a bit away from political positions about a few key issues that are problematic in every kind of negotiation. I think we have a handful of problems around the question of who would be bound, what would be the means of implementation of this treaty, how everybody is going to be affected. So there is really trust and comfort building yet to be done. I think we've made some progress. Without it, we wouldn't have an IGC right now. And we are entering the final stages of lifting those barriers, looking how benefit it can be for everyone.
Thank you, Florian. Yes, Liz.
Thank you. So I think, just picking up on the points of the other speakers, I think that we just unpacked one portion of the package here today. So I think that the complexity of the negotiations, not just in this element, but in the others as well, makes for it in some ways, while we are trying to very hard to make this a comprehensive treaty, it is sort of negotiating these four elements and trying to move forward those objectives as much as possible. So the complexity is one of the issues. I think too, despite the long and winding road, at least in the last 5 years, things have actually moved rather quickly, I would say, from the ending of the ad hoc, informal, open-ended working group to explore the issue, which ended in 2013, I believe, to the start of the preparatory committee, was sort of the pre-negotiation phase, which took place for 2 years, that laid the groundwork for the negotiation phase that we're in now. That has gone, I think, remarkably quickly in international negotiations terms. And part of that, I think, is inspired by you all and by the relentless bad news that we get every time I was going to say open the newspaper, but click on our phones or whatever. But the bad news from the ocean, sadly, is coming forward more and more. And I think this is one of the few instruments out there that is in progress that offers some hope. And so I think that is what we need to ride, that level of, that feeling of hope, that this moment of momentum. In 2018, I was joking with colleagues that this was the year of the oceans, but really it feels like 2020 now is becoming the year of the oceans, and every year is, we're living the year of the oceans every year.
Thanks very much. Other questions? I see Scott way in the back. Yes, go ahead.
Scott Hayjost, Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition board member and managing director at the National Whistleblower Center. These have been excellent presentations. And I noted the reference to the Southern Ocean, Antarctica, in this high seas session. I was just curious if somebody might want to talk a little bit about the practical connections, however informal they might be, between things experienced as the Antarctic Treaty System deals with marine conservation and MPAs, which for many are high seas, and these negotiations. And I'll throw the CBD in there, for that matter, as well, which also touches on these issues and has a very important COP coming up in China. And I do have a second question, and that is to hear a little bit about the enforcement and compliance mechanisms that are being considered for these high seas negotiations, because that really becomes very important if this all means something in implementation.
Thanks, Scott. Well, maybe I'll take a stab at your first question, but if the other panelists want to jump in, I'd certainly welcome that. Yeah, there are One of the reasons the negotiation's taking as long as it is because the first question you asked is so hard to answer. How will a new global agreement interact with existing regional agreements such as CAMLR or the other sectoral bodies or global bodies such as the International Maritime Organization? We don't have an answer to that question yet. We did have a chat about this among some of the negotiators and other stakeholders behind closed doors this morning here. I'm not sure we actually broke a lot of new ground, but at least led me to think that there are possible solutions out there. There is a commitment not to undermine regimes such as CAMLR. On the other hand, there are plenty of places in the world where there is no type CAMLR, right? So how can this new global agreement fill the gaps, strengthen the existing regimes, hopefully make them work better as a group together, but also add sort of new layers of protection? We don't know yet. That's one of the unanswered questions. There was also a question about enforcement on the high seas, right? That's tempting, but I might pass on that one. Well, I could say normally enforcement on the high seas is the responsibility of a flag state. There are some limited exceptions to that, as I'm sure you know. I don't know if that has come up much in the negotiations so far. What do people think about that?
Well, I'll take the first question also first, but then I'll also touch on the enforcement and compliance issue. So to your question about, I also heard in your question, was there any looking to what those other bodies are doing to help inform the negotiations? And I think the answer is both yes and no. I think that this treaty is being negotiated as an implementing agreement to UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, and because of that unique universe of legal children, as it were, that is spawned from UNCLOS, I think very much a lot of the precedent and relationship has been very circular within that family, going to the family vacation metaphor. That being said, there are many of us, I think, both from the country delegations as well as the academics and NGO communities that have worked in many different fora, and so are trying to bring sort of best practices and precedents, legal precedents from those fora to bear, and maybe even practical experiences to bear into informing the negotiations and the development of the treaty. Your point about CBD is really interesting as well. As many of you may know, the CBD is currently negotiating or thinking about what the post-2020 biodiversity framework will be, noting that the current biodiversity conservation targets developed in 2010 are some sunsetting, as it were, in 2020. And so how will those be carried forward? And as part of that conversation on the marine target in particular, there's been conversation about how, based on scientific studies that have shown that at least 30% of the ocean needs to be protected in order to maintain a healthy ocean ecosystem. So the question is, how do you get to that 30% if you're not looking at the high seas? And so I think there is that conversation starting to happen, and I've started going to CBD CBD meetings. I know some of the BBNJ delegates have also newly started looking at that fora, and in that fora, the High Seas Treaty has come up in conversation, though I think tentatively. So to the question about enforcement and compliance, I think within the treaty context and the legal text, there's absolutely a recognized need that those are very key components to making sure that you have any effective agreement, and then particularly on the area-based management tools and MPAs, that's an important component for MPAs to be effective. The how, I think, will be a mixed bag of tools, as it were. There's technologies, there's state responsibility, and states enforcing their or setting down laws and policies that regulate their nationals and industry activities. And then there's this notion of, I guess, shared responsibility of the global community. So it's not just, it is the high seas. It isn't just necessarily, or wouldn't fall just to the proponent state of an MPA proposal to do all of the monitoring and enforcement and compliance, but that it would be a shared activity that would be part of the global community obligation and responsibilities.
Thank you. You want to add something? Please.
I quickly add a couple of things. One is, for Americans, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which CBD, we are not a party to, and we tend to ignore it, but it is virtually a universal treaty, and it's, I think, important for Americans to start paying more attention to it. And I would echo what Liz said. I came to that realization when I realized that everybody else in the room is following the Convention on Biological Diversity. So that's one thing. Scott, you asked a question about compliance, but your own organization is, of course, INECE, one of the bodies that we would turn to for good thinking about this. It hasn't been a central issue in the negotiation, but obviously it's coming up now, and we'll have to be thinking about it. And there's one other point about that. We always think about flag state control, port state control, but as ways of exercising jurisdiction on the high seas. But it's also important to think about how we exercise control through national governments on the people who finance some of the negative activities, who register companies. There may be other tools we can use than those that strictly go to the ships out on the ocean.
Okay, thank you. I think you have time for one or two more questions. Yes, please, right here in front. Mariah?
Thank you. Kate Morrison with the Ocean Foundation. I was curious, I know at least before the PrepCom stage, the issue of sharing genetic resources was a really contentious issue under sort of the context of common heritage of mankind. And I was just curious how that's played out in the formal negotiations and how it continues to play out, I guess I should say.
So it's not so much the sharing of the resources themselves, it's the sharing sort of the value of what they might be turned into. We could have had an entire day devoted to that topic too, at least. But maybe a quick answer, even though you may not have come prepared to talk about the marine genetic resources stuff. Florian?
Well, the very quick answer indeed is that there is we're talking about a couple of things when we talk about the benefit sharing of MGRs. It's either the non-monetary benefits or the monetary benefits. I won't go into the details of the positions, but the interest of the question in my mind is also to link it with the capacity building item of the negotiation. We need to make sure that the information we take from MGRs are able to be used by everyone, and that necessitates capacity building, human resources, financial support, integrated scientific programs so that all can benefit from the different information data that we get through the MGRs. And at least this would be a huge, would be hugely beneficial to everyone. Once again, I won't open the door of the monetary benefits and what are the positions and how it should all work, because that will be addressed by the next sessions of the PrepCom. But let's not forget also that beyond the monetary aspect, there is a scientific or research aspect that's very important in that regard as well.
Okay, thank you. Yes, in the back.
I always have concerns when...
Sir, could you introduce yourself,
Oh,
please?
I'm sorry. My name is Alice Ortiza, and I'm a researcher and writer.
Thank you.
And I have extensively researched holistic medicine and life-saving procedures that are in Index Medica, such as intravenous vitamin C that saved lives regarding polio, pneumonia, influenza. So my concern is the acceptance without a lot of questioning that what we might gain from the seas and from some of these very damaging practices are attempted to be justified by characterizing them as possibly life-saving and therefore difficult to put barriers against or to even question. And I just want to encourage all of you and your colleagues to look closer at holistic medicine. And a lot of what doctors accomplished between 1948 and 1978, where intravenous vitamin C cured polio, doctors documented they never lost a case to pneumonia or influenza, no matter how close to death the patient was. These are in the literature, but you're not going to find them in Index Medicus.
Okay.
And that's the problem. And it pains me to think of possible destruction of our seas and of the marine life to save lives without having a very thorough investigation of what safe and effective and non-lethal to anything else alternatives there are to these remedies.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm not sure there was a question, but yet another reason to move forward with these negotiations, it seems to me. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a long afternoon. I'd like to bring this session to a close. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel. And let me then thank once again our partners, the Pew Charitable Trusts, the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation, for their support, and thank all of you for coming and your interest. This was streamed live. It will also be archived on the Wilson Center website for those of you who want to go back and see what was said or spread the word. There will be other events coming up on topics such as this. Stay in touch with us. We look forward to seeing you back here again. Have a good evening.